pilgrimages are important and transformational, and you should go on one, and I'm going to make that case in just a moment. I'll be right back. Well, hey there, everybody. It's Mike Creavey from thegraciousguest.org here with you for another episode of The Gracious Guest Show. And I'm really, really excited for this one. It's been sort of a long time coming, even though I didn't realize it at first. And I'm going to talk about that here in just a moment. But before I do, please make sure that you subscribe to this channel. Share this video far and wide. Check out the links below. I'm going to talk about those a couple times throughout here today. Really great resources for you to definitely check out. Today I'm joined by Steve Ray from CatholicConvert.com. From Ignatius Press, from EWTN fame. You've seen Steve probably at some point. If you're watching this channel, there's a good chance that you've seen his work before. But for those of you who aren't really familiar, Steve is an apologist. He's a Catholic convert. He is someone who has really affected my life in a lot of different ways over the years. I first saw him probably through EWTN or through a faith CD of some kind. I don't remember exactly the first time I heard Steve's name, but Steve goes very far back into my own faith journey, my own discovery of my Catholic faith. And I was raised Catholic, but I didn't really pursue it intellectually that much, really, until I was in college. And so Steve's work, Steve's commentary, Steve's books, his audio presentations, and his movies that he's going to talk about here in a little bit were enormously impactful for me in my own faith journey. And in particular, I was really affected by the movies I mentioned, his documentary series, Footprints of God, where he and his wife Janet would go all over the world to different sites that basically were right out of Scripture, right off the pages of Scripture. He would tell the story of Moses, the story of Abraham, the story of St. Peter, St. Paul, the Apostolic Fathers, and all throughout he goes to these locations and really helps just, through this documentary experience, make those places come alive. And then so it was years after I was familiar with those productions that I was aware then of also his Footprints of God pilgrimages that he and his wife Janet would lead many, many times throughout the year. And it just so happened that when I was in Iraq on my deployment there back in 2008, that my brother, who was home from his first deployment, we both had some money that we had saved up because we were deployed and couldn't do anything with it. And we were able to actually plan this pilgrimage and go together. And we went a few months after I got back from my deployment and a few months before he went on his second tour. So we had both been in Iraq, which itself, of course, is a biblical land, the home place of Abraham. That idea had really hit us while we were there, just in that combat environment. We were both affected multiple times by just the dramatic realization that we were in those places. There's stories from the book of Tobit, for example, of Tobias's journey with the Archangel Raphael, where he's along the Tigris River, the Euphrates River, and I'm right next to these rivers. And so we really wanted to go on a pilgrimage. We got to go just a few months, like I said, after I got back from my tour, on a Footprints of St. Paul pilgrimage, where we went through many different countries. I'm going to talk about some of that here in a minute with Steve in the interview. But suffice it to say, it was an absolutely incredible experience. So sit back, relax, and I know you're going to enjoy this conversation between Steve and I about pilgrimages, why you should go on a pilgrimage, what a pilgrimage is really all about, and a little bit about Steve's new book, all about the book of Genesis, his new commentary on Genesis, also linked below. He gets into that a little bit near the end of this interview, so enjoy. All right, Steve Ray, it's a real delight and honor to have you here on the Gracious Guest Show.
Well, thank you, Mike. It's always good to be here with you.
Well, and it's something I've shared before a couple times with my audience. I don't remember if I've done it on the YouTube version yet, but I did it on audio podcast a couple years back, talking a little bit about the pilgrimage that my brother Joe and I got to go on with you and Janet and that whole crew back in March of 2009. So I will no doubt probably bring some things up here and there as we go, just that were wonderful experiences from that. But maybe for those who aren't familiar with the pilgrimage side of things here, what's been your own experience specifically with kind of how you maybe initially got into pilgrimages and how it became such a centerpiece of what you and Janet do?
Well, Janet and I lead 10 to 11 pilgrimages a year and have been doing that for pushing 20 years now. And and actually, I'll just say a plug in for my son, who is now my son and daughter have started a new venture based kind of off of our model. Ours is called Footprints of God, and they're kind of upscale pilgrimages. So we have wine with dinner and do things very nice. But my son and daughter are doing something called inheritance pilgrimages, and they're selling out buses. And this is all just young people from 18 to 25 years old. And it's about half the price because they're staying in, hot, not as fancy places and not doing it, no wine with dinner and stuff like that. But anyway, and so what the Jews do a thing called birthright, where they bring over 50,000 young Jewish students from America to Israel to teach them their birthright so they can be proud of their Jewish heritage, see the Western Wall and Masada and Jerusalem, all these things. And then it gives them this pride and they stay Jewish in a sense. But my son, we got the idea, we're losing 90% of our students when they go through university. What if we had the same kind of a thing and we took them over and taught them their inheritance, immerse them in the Bible for 7 or 8 days, have a lot of fun over there, learn why they're Catholic, learn the foundations of the Catholic faith. So my son and daughter are starting that adventure now, and it's a whole different program than what we do. And it looks like it's going to be a huge success. But Janet and I, we lead pilgrimages. It started just to Israel. I'll give kind of the history of it. We became Catholic 1994. We'd never been to the Holy Land. We've been all over Europe studying our Reformation roots and defending Martin Luther and John Calvin and all these guys. Then in 1994, we converted to the Catholic Church. And all of a sudden, I had this insatiable desire to go see the land of the Bible. And I think it might have been as a Catholic now, I had more of a sacramental, incarnational view of things, that the land really meant something, that God uses things and stuff and land, holy ground, things like this. Much more of a Catholic concept than a Protestant. So we went in 1995, just with a small group. I didn't lead it. I went with our parish as a pilgrim with a backpack on and a big camera. And I remember getting off the plane, and I was so overcome with emotion, I just fell on the tarmac and I wept, and I just laid on and kissed the stupid blacktop. But I had been raised as a Baptist to love the Bible and love Jesus and love all this, and all of a sudden I just realized I'm standing in the very land. It was as far away to me before as the moon, and now all of a sudden there I was, and I cried my way through the whole pilgrimage. My poor wife had to put up with me. I remember I had just written my book on one of the first times I went on Peter, the primacy. It's called Upon This Rock. And they asked me at the Primacy of Peter Church to read. And I said, a reading from the second letter of Peter. And I got choked up. And I tried and I tried, and it took at least 60 seconds. I finally sat down. I couldn't do it. And the priest had to get somebody else to do the reading. But I cried my way through the Holy Land. It was just such a powerful, profound, emotional, spiritual experience for me.
Yeah.
Well, we came back and we said, I can't believe that we went there, Janet. We got to go back just to make sure we were really there. I mean, it was just I felt like I was in a spiritual experience the whole time. I never really realized my feet were touching the ground. So 6 weeks later, we went back again, and I took our kids this time. And I wanted to go back and see it again for myself and have the kids go with us, and had a huge impact on. Now my kids have gone multiple times, and I've taken all of their spouses. They're all married. And now I'm starting to take my grandkids.
Wow.
And because it has such a huge impact on young people, as you know, you were kind of a young guy.
Yeah.
And so in 1995, we went back again. And then in the year 2000, I had, in the middle of the night in around September, I don't know whether it was a dream or a vision or an angel or indigestion. I don't know what woke me up. I'm not presumptuous.
Yeah.
But I knew exactly what I had to do. And I said to my wife, Janet, we have to wake up. It was pitch dark. I scared her half to death. Wake up. We got to do a 10-part video series on the history of salvation from a Catholic perspective. We got to make movies, Janet. And she said, You woke me up and scared me half to death to tell me that we're supposed to make movies.
She's probably
What
like,
is
go
God?
back to bed.
Yes, go back to sleep. She said, that's a stupid idea. She said, we can't even take good pictures. How does God expect us to make movies? And she rolled over and went back to sleep. And I got up that night though, and I was in a lot of the big decisions in our life have come through dreams. I have to say that some of the biggest decisions, Janet or me having a dream, and this was one of them. And normally you would just say I was a stupid dream, go back to sleep. But I got up that night and I was inspired, and I typed out the outline for a 10-part series of the whole story of salvation from Abraham to
Wow.
Augustine. And it had to all be filmed on location in Iraq and Israel and Syria and Jordan. And it had to tell the whole story of the Bible. It had to be a travel log so people could see these places really existed, that this really happened. This is true history. It had to be a Bible study. It had to be apologetics, learning how to defend the Catholic faith. And more than anything else, it had to be a rollicking adventure, kind of like the Indiana Jones or Crocodile
Yeah.
Hunter, that kind of a thing.
Yes.
Well, I called Ignatius Press that day, and I had a book or two out, with a couple books out with them already. And they said, fly out and tell us your idea. So we jumped on a plane, flew out to their board meeting in San Francisco. Father Fessio asked me 3 questions after. Oh, first of all, they had wine with lunch, a bottle of white wine and red wine. I waited till they finished both bottles before I gave them my idea. And that's true too. So he said, okay, tell us your
Wisdom.
idea. Yeah. Tell us your idea, he said. I said, okay. I had written it out and the whole plan kind of on paper, and I handed it to him. And I explained what I wanted to do, a documentary series on hands-on everywhere location, very Catholic. He said, has anything been done like this before? I said, no, not Catholic, Protestant, Jewish, nothing that I know of this expansive. 10 documentaries. He said, how much will it cost? I said, I don't know, but I have friends in the business that tell me it'll be over $2 million. He said, the third question is, how soon can you begin? $50,000. I'm going to wire it into your checking account before you get home. I want you to start. 6 weeks later, we were flying all over Israel, Turkey, Egypt, Italy in helicopters, getting all the aerial footage that I needed ahead of time. If we were doing it today, we'd be using drones.
Right.
But back in those, we didn't have drones. So we're renting these helicopters in all these countries. And it's been 20 years. I still have one left to do. We've got 9 done, one left to do. But the reason I brought that up is because people started saying in the year 2004, roughly, or 5, people were watching the videos. They became very good sellers on Ignatius Press. They're on EWTN. They're on Netflix. So people started saying, Steve, you took us to the Holy Land in the movies. Why don't you take us in person? You know the land. So if you put together a trip over there, we'll go with you. So I put them out. Why not put on my website? Let's call it Footprints of God. That's what the movies were called, Footprints of God. God came down and got his feet dirty right here with us. That's how he brought salvation, by becoming one of us and getting his feet dirty. So I said, okay, we'll call it Footprints of God Pilgrimages. I put it on my website and it sold out overnight. And we had a bus full of people. And we went and we had an absolute blast, Mike. We just couldn't believe that I had gone as a pilgrim, but now I'm going as a pilgrimage leader, and I get to teach along the way. I get to get the Bible out. And this is why we Catholics love the Mount of Transfiguration, why we love the Annunciation, all these places. And so then we said, let's do another one. So we put up a website and we started doing a couple of them a year to Israel. And then the people that went to Israel with us said, where else are you going to go, Steve? And I go, I never thought of that. Well, Rome. And they said, good, we'll go with you. So we started taking groups to Italy and to Rome. And then it was St. Paul cruise. And then it was Poland. We're leaving in a week for Poland right now.
Yeah.
First trip back with my knees after my knees have been replaced 4 months ago. I think I'm going to do okay. We'll see. But going to Poland, and then 4 trips to Israel still this year. 4 more trips to Israel with groups this year. So then it was Poland, and then it was Ireland, all these Catholic sites. I have no interest in going to Jamaica or Hawaii. Don't waste my time. I want to go to biblical Catholic lands. I want to learn.
Guadalupe and
yes, and then Guadalupe got added into the mix, and Lourdes and Fatima. So these are all pilgrimages we kind of rotate now. 7 a year to Israel, 7 a year to the Holy Land, but then we rotate the cruise, Poland, Guadalupe, through the years, 3 or 4 a year. So that's how it got started. And here we are now. We took our first trip in 1995. with our parish, and now we're going to go
Oh,
4 more times this year. My wife and I have been to the Holy Land now over 200 times
that's astonishing.
with 100 groups, but we've gone over to make movies for friends'
Yeah.
weddings now and things like that. So 200 times, that's a lot of Delta miles.
Well, and I can speak just from experience that it was such a, and it's, I think, just sort of assumed through here that I'm 100% on board and such a fan. All these years later, I've got all the links and stuff below, and I've always turned people in your direction for sure, because it was such a comprehensive experience. And everything was taken care of, quite frankly, and you guys took us to so many places that were sort of off the beaten path too, right? And supporting those local Christian
Right.
communities, which is a huge important thing to us. And you took the word right out of my mouth when you said incarnational up front, because that's the word that came to mind when I was sort of prepping a little bit today and just trying to reflect a little. And that's exactly how it felt. I think I forget who it was, or one of the priests on our trip had uh, I forget what the readings were off the top of my head, but they had us, my brother and I, do um, both readings for the mass at Shepherd's Fields, I guess, which is one of those sites. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's the same set of readings each day because of
Yep.
the significance of that location. So it's these Christmas readings, and we were just blown away. Like both of us, like sitting down, looking at each other. Then the Gospels read, and we're like, I look over to my left, and like there's the field that story happened at, and it's just there's no way to
Yep.
convey what that feels
Yep.
like, to folks unless they've been there.
The Vatican has given the Franciscans permission to change the readings
Hmm.
of the gospel for the masses. And the masses at the holy sites are site specific at all of them, if you remember.
Yeah.
So that if when we're at the Annunciation, it's always the readings of the Annunciation. Doesn't matter whether it's Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, June, July, or August. It's always the same readings because it's site specific. So when you go to these sites, that's what the readings are.
Right.
And now they've changed it so they said, and the shepherds were out in these fields. And in
These
the
fields.
readings, it's actually in bold text. And
Wow.
Jesus went up this high mountain. And I
Yeah.
tell the deacon or the priest when they're reading it, emphasize it. See the bold word right there?
Mm-hmm.
Emphasize that.
Let it
And when
sink
we
in.
went to Capernaum, it's we do the readings of John chapter 6 of eat my
Mm-hmm.
flesh and drink my blood, and the reading is long. And I tell the deacon or the priest, and when you get to the end, I want you to be very dramatic, because the last verses, Jesus spoke these words in the synagogue at Capernaum, and then you turn and you point, and that's the synagogue right there.
That's so awesome. Well, and you talked a little bit here about just the kind of bottom line in some sense of just why. I mean, that's sufficient reason enough, I think, for people to look into it. This way to tangibly connect with the Gospels, and not just the Gospels, but the whole Old Testament, all of salvation history. But maybe walk us through here a little bit about maybe some of the bigger picture of the history of pilgrimage, kind of how this really uh, became a tradition, because there's pilgrimages, of course, as you mentioned, all over the place. There's the
Right.
the Camino, of course, in Spain. There's these ways of connecting with our heritage. Maybe speak to that just a little bit more about holy ground and what what makes some place holy
Okay.
and worth visiting.
I think the pilgrimage is part of the human condition, actually, because it's not just us Christians that do it. The Muslims take pilgrimages to the Hajj
Yeah.
in Saudi Arabia and Mecca, and the Jews have always taken pilgrimages. And I find that now even some Protestants are going to the graves of some of their famous evangelists of the past. As much as Martin Luther was very much opposed to pilgrimages, and so Protestantism, they
Oh,
won't even call it a pilgrimage; they call it a tour.
okay.
And but they still do it as well. So I think it's part of the human condition to want to go back and discover our roots. And the word pilgrim just means a sojourner, a traveler, a foreigner, someone who leaves the comfort zone of their home and their land, and they go out in search of something else, maybe their roots. Now look at the pilgrims that came to America. We also call them pilgrims, and they left England for religious reasons. They were opposed to the religious tyranny of the Church of England, and they came over here as Puritans to start their own freedom of religion. And they're called pilgrims because they left their home and they went as sojourners and travelers to another place. When we read Interesting, people don't realize this, but Psalm 120 through 134 in the Bible, those 15 Psalms are called the Psalms of Ascent, going up. They're also called the pilgrimage Psalms because those are the 15 Psalms that the Jews chanted as they went up to Jerusalem for the Passover and for the high and holy feast days. So Jesus went on a pilgrimage every year of his life, at least one, for the Passover.
Right.
And they would have left Nazareth, and it was a 5 to 12 day walk. They would have walked from morning till night, and the whole town of Nazareth would go together. And we hear about the synodal way, the synods that they have coming up right now. I'm not going to comment on all that, but the funny thing is that word synod means walking together. And it's actually the word synod is used in the Greek in one verse. Only one time that word synod is used, and it's this one. And when the feast was ended, as Mary, Jesus, and Joseph were returning, the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem. So they're on a pilgrimage, and they start heading home. And his parents did not know it, but supposing him to be with the group, they went a day's journey. But then they began to search for him among the relatives and acquaintances, and he wasn't there. So this gives you a very interesting picture of a pilgrimage in the first century. The Holy Family went on. Their friends and acquaintances, all of Nazareth, the people they knew, would go together as a caravan. Men and women were separated because even in a wedding today, I've been to weddings of our friends in Nazareth. The women and the men are in separate parts of the house, and so Joseph is over here with the men and Mary's over here with the women, and they assume Jesus is with the other one or with the kids playing. They get to the end of the day and he's not there. What a panic mode anyway. But my point is that they actually traveled together. They were pilgrims. They were chanting those 15 Psalms, 120 through 134. One of them is, I rejoiced when they said, let us go into the house of the Lord. And when you're going up to Jerusalem, Psalm 122. But the word there, they were supposing him to be in the group. That word group is synod. It means pilgrims. They assumed that he was with the pilgrims, with the travelers, with those people traveling together. That's what the root word means in Greek. So Jesus went on a pilgrimage at least once a year. So we didn't start it. They started it.
Right.
Look at Elijah went on a pilgrimage to Mount Sinai after his battle with Ahab and Jezebel. He took off and he went 40 days all the way to Mount Sinai. Paul went to Mount Sinai. In Galatians, it says that he went to Sinai and he met with God there. So this whole idea of a pilgrimage is built into us, I think, and especially into the whole Judeo-Christian mentality. And we go back because it is holy ground. That's why we call it the Holy Land. Holy means sanctified or set apart. People say, well, Steve, what about Rome? I said, that's sacred ground, not holy ground. God never walked there.
You're right.
It's sacred because of the blood of the martyrs and the blood of the saints. It's been made sacred because of the great work of God sanctifying that land by the blood of Peter and Paul and all the Roman martyrs. There's sacred ground, but I don't know if any technician would agree with me or not, but I've always said that only in the biblical lands is it holy ground where God actually came down. The first time that we hear of it is in Exodus, where Moses is out in the wilderness at Mount Sinai, and he's going past a bush. And he went past that bush every day. He'd been out there for 40 years. 40 years in the desert leading those sheep. And every day he'd walk across that dirt and those rocks. And then one day God was there. And he said, take off your sandals. So this is holy ground. And Moses could have said, what do you mean? I've walked on this ground every day. There's nothing different. It looks exactly the same today as it did yesterday and last week and last month. Why do I have to take my shoes off? Because I'm here now, God says. I have sanctified this. And my presence makes this holy. Take off your shoes. And that was in holy ground. And I love another passage with Naaman the Syrian. He has leprosy and he leaves Syria and comes down during the time of Elisha, the prophet. And Elisha says, go dip yourself in the Jordan. He does. And he's healed of his leprosy. And what he does on the way back is so interesting. He says, will you mind if I have 2 mules here. I would like to take dirt from this land and load these 2 mules up with the land, because from now on, when I go back to Syria, I will only worship the God of Israel, and I'm standing on his ground. So, in other words, he wanted the land, the dirt from the land of God, to take with him up to Syria. And then he's going to create an altar, and he's going to put that dirt there, and he's going to
Yes.
stand on God's dirt when he worships. This is the whole, I think, Jewish Catholic idea, not Protestant, but the Jewish Catholic idea of holy ground, of something that God sanctifies by his presence. So when we go there, I doubt we do pilgrimages much better than when we took you, because every time we tweak it, and it gets a little better
Yeah.
and a little better. We're always
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
what can we do better next time? And what can I teach more precisely next time?
Right.
So we tell people that when you come there, you think you're going to touch the land, you're going to touch the ground here. But be careful, because this is holy ground, and it's going to reach up and grab you.
Yes.
And I've seen it do that to so many people. The land gets them.
I wished I had a friend who went around the same time we did. We became friends later, and I could have kicked myself because he showed me in his Bible. He had done something I wish I would have thought of. But when he was in Gethsemane, he had his Bible with him, and he had taken up just some dirt from Gethsemane and rubbed it over the word Gethsemane in his Bible. And I said, "Oh my gosh!" I said that would have. Oh, but yeah, that's that same idea.
Yeah, yeah. I remember one guy came with me with his wife, and he didn't want to come. He says to me, "Steve, I'm a reluctant pilgrim. I'll let you know that right from the beginning. I don't really want to be here." He says, "My wife went fishing with me up north last year, and now I'm paying the penalty." I said, she'd go fishing with me if I'd go with her to the Holy Land.
That's a big trade.
It is. So he says, "So here I am." That was his comment. "So here I am." I said, "That's okay. I'm glad you're with us." Third day into the trip, we're at the church of Capernaum, where Jesus said, "Eat my flesh and drink my blood." And he hears those gospel readings during that mass, and he sees that synagogue, and he goes up and he receives the body and blood of Christ, where Jesus said, "Eat my flesh and drink my blood." And he came out of that mass with tears running down his eyes, and he said, "Steve, I'm not a reluctant pilgrim anymore. I just realized where I am." The land had reached up and grabbed him. So this is the whole idea of holy ground. And when people go there, I don't know that there are bad pilgrimages. I mean, poorly handled, poorly managed, lousy food, lousy hotels. There are those. But even if someone goes in a lousy group, they still come away affected by it. And you just can't go to these sites and know where you are and what you're touching and seeing without having it affect you.
I think for me it was it was a lot of stuff, but the two that really just usually jump to mind right away are when we were there. We got to go to because our pilgrimage, to recap for those who hadn't heard my previous show on it, we flew into Athens, and then we did Corinth. We did a few days in Greece, and then we sailed. So we did all along Turkey, going in for excursions during the day and visiting these places that Paul was at, and then we get to Antioch, where they were first called Christians, and we had that sort of secretive mass, real quick, because I believe that's somewhat not kosher according to Turkish law and that kind of stuff. But we got to have this mass in this cave church, and you could still see. Isn't there like a tunnel there, if I remember correctly? Like there's like an escape route or something, or there were ways that they could get out. If
the
they were
Church of St.
discovered.
Peter in a cave. Yep. If anybody wants to see it, by the way, it's in my movie on St. Peter.
Yes, yeah. There's great footage of it, and just thinking to myself, like, this is Paul came through here. Peter came through. Like, I'm going down the list of all these saints who are at some point in that same place. So that's one of them. And then the other one, of course, is the tomb, like to actually go into Christ's tomb within the broader sort of complex of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And that was before the big renovation. I saw that great National Geographic special on that then just a few years ago. So I'd love to go back. But that was, now a skeptic, you can't just convince someone with your words always, right? Most of the time you can't, but someone would just maybe blow this off. But I've told people, I said, I can't describe the feeling, the sense of walking in and seeing the empty tomb with my own eyes. It's 2,000 years ago. I mean, you can fill in the blank with any skeptical argument for what happened to Jesus's body. But for me, it was just the actual personal experience of I've now been in his empty tomb also,
Yep. Yep.
and he's not in there. I don't even remember who was behind me in line. It was someone from another group. My brother and I came out, and I just said to the next guy, I said, "He's not in there." Was the
Very
impulse.
good.
So that was wonderful.
Yeah. I tell people that he comes out every morning for them, though, because we have mass at the tomb.
Yeah.
And I said that the tomb is empty, but he comes out again for you in the form of the Blessed Sacrament. He comes back out of the tomb and appears to you again each
Yeah.
morning in the
That's
sacrament.
great. Oh, I have so many questions to ask. Yeah, we have a good amount of time here, so we can maybe get through some of them. Because I was um, wondering about a couple other, uh, I guess, a couple different things here. Maybe I could approach it this way here, as far as penance. The penitential aspect of pilgrimage. For anyone who's seen the movie The Way, which I've talked about quite a bit, I did a review of it a while back too. I show that each year to my students because there's so many just phenomenal themes in it that just jump out at you. And I guess this goes to what you were saying earlier about going, kind of with a group, maybe versus going on your own. Because I think we talk about both, right, in the tradition of this idea of this personal sort of experience of pilgrimage, but also going with a group. And I tend to be of the opinion that even if you go on an individual one, God draws you into this
He
experience with
does.
others anyway.
You miss a
So
lot if
maybe,
you do that way, though. You miss the
right.
daily masses with the group.
Yes.
You miss the daily interaction with others and the prayer together of the rosary on the bus. And there's things you can do as a group that you can't do as an individual.
Right. And with that, I guess, well, either way, maybe just speak to this a little bit, if you would, about the in some of the history, maybe this too, this idea of the penitential aspect of it. And some may have heard of that idea of maybe sometimes in Christian history more prevalently than now, but just as important maybe now, the importance of this being sort of an act of penance as well.
Which is one of the reasons why Martin Luther despised pilgrimages,
Ah,
because of the whole Catholic idea that you go there to expiate your sins or
yeah.
to do works of repentance, that kind of thing. And he said, "No, we're saved by faith alone. You don't have,
Mm,
don't do any of these things that the Catholics do." So, but that it is exactly correct. Less so for us, I think, today, because we get on a big Delta jet and fly over there and got a nice guide and group and a Mercedes bus to pick you up and take you to a luxury hotel
well,
where you have a
TSA
glass.
can be a little penitential
Yes,
sometimes.
traveling is penitential. It can be, no matter how comfortable it is. But in the old days, for example, there's a nun called Egeria who went at the end of the 4th century, around 380, and she wrote a journal along the way. And it's fascinating to read her journal because she mentions the same places we're visiting now when we go.
Mm,
And but for her to leave Spain, and that's not United States, to leave Spain is a long ship ride. And then you get off and you get on a camels and you go across from the water to these sites. And where we can hit 3, 4, 5 sites a day on a good day, you may hit one site a day back in then that time because you're on a camel and it takes a long time to get between places. But when people left back in those days to go on a pilgrim from England or France or from Spain, they said goodbye to their family because it was going to be a year or two before they came back.
mm,
And many times they didn't come back. They died over there. So when you left to go on a pilgrimage, anytime up until the modern age, not only did you were risking your life and travel, but you also, there would be conflicts with the Muslims over there
right.
and the local peoples. So you were really putting your life in God's hands. It was a penitential thing. Many people left as a way to purify their souls, to become holy, because oftentimes it's through suffering. It says that even Jesus learned obedience from the things he suffered. And so it was a way that you would go and you knew you were going to suffer. And it was kind of like Catholics say to offer it up when you're in pain or something, offer it up. That this was something that they offered up, their arduous trip and their suffering and the sweat and the muscle pains and achenesses and blisters and sores on your feet, and you'd offer it up to God, and you would actually go there not knowing if you'd ever come home again.
Mm.
Now we have it much easier. But I do think it's the same for people today because they've lived the Catholic faith. They've heard these readings from the Bible. But all of a sudden now to go see it can be penitential in the sense that you go there to get out of your comfort zone. These young people that are going with my son and daughter, these are very astute young people. Many of them left their gadgets at home, or they leave their smartphones in the
Wow.
hotel. They don't want to be consumed with those things. They want to be able to experience the land without, and that's penitential too,
Mm-hmm.
setting those things aside so you can have a better close. But penitential, what does it do? Obviously, the whole thing is to eliminate sin from our life, to get into a position where we're out of our comfort zone and we're dependent upon God. We're in God's face, so to speak, and we're in his land, and we're there to learn about him and to experience him in a new way.
Mm.
So all of those things are very much a part of a pilgrimage, I think, even though they're
Well,
pretty comfortable today, at least
well,
with
and
us.
and I just even enjoy sometimes too, like this, and this isn't, by any means remotely close to the top of the benefits that I've taken away, all these years ago, and hope to, of course, go again. Well, a quick side note before I say this, my wife and I then got to go on our honeymoon. We did basically a pilgrimage through Italy. I got married in 2015. That's already almost 10 years ago now. But so that was, I've, which some people have asked me, they're like, well, those traditional Christian pilgrimages to the Holy Land, to Rome, various places in Italy, and then are you going to do the Camino? And sometimes I say, well, I don't know if I'm really, I'm not the biggest sort of like physical fitness guy, so I don't know. We'll see. I know a lot of people have done that one, but rambly way of bringing up one of my favorite, just non-important but fun aspects of it is just seeing it again, like we said before. Being in those places, seeing the terrain, how some of my misconceptions, of reading scripture or hearing scripture
Yep.
stories, or when you watch movies, you can say, hey, that's pretty accurate, or well, that one's
Yep.
not so much. So that might annoy others. But that was one big thing for me. I think I knew enough about geography. A lot of people, maybe not so much. I just think a lot of people think it's all desert, for one thing.
Yeah.
And you get there and you're like, wait a minute, Jesus probably walked through some trees and forested areas a lot more than I realized, so that's been kind of a
Yep.
neat discovery too.
In reading the Bible and celebrating Mass and being a Catholic, it's one of the things, I've written several books about the Bible, and one we're going to talk about shortly, my new book on
Mhm.
Genesis. But one of the things that helps me to write those is the need when you are teaching, reading the Bible, celebrating Mass if you're a priest. Context is so important because you can't understand, let's just as simply, you can't understand the Bible if you're reading it in English in America, 2 to 4,000 years removed, with a different language, totally different culture, different lifestyle, because you're so far removed. We're at a great disadvantage. But to get a kind of a grasp of the original languages and how there's nuances to the words that are being
Mm.
used. For example, Eskimos, I have heard, have about 40 different words for snow because it's their life. So there's
Yeah.
mushy snow, crusted snow, fresh snow,
Yeah.
because it's, for me, it's
Adjectives
snow.
for, or yeah, just for different, yeah.
They got all these different words. Well, the shepherds have different words for their sheep too, and traveling, and the way they
Mm.
travel. And one way is when you travel with flocks and herds, you can only travel 6 miles a day. If you were just you and I were going, it would be
Mm.
20 miles a day. And they
Mhm.
have different words for travel, which means what kind of travel it is, because that's what they did. They
Ah.
walked everywhere. And did they have children with them and old people in flocks, or did they go quickly with a bunch of guys like in a military force? So the context is so important. And if you don't have the context, you can't understand really all that you're reading. You only get a portion of it. To
Yeah.
walk in that land and then to come back. I know people that say, I'm at Mass and I hear the Gospels and I just want to jab the person next to me and say, I was there. I was there. But it really is to understand the context, especially for a teacher
Yeah.
or someone who's studying scripture or writing books. in writing Genesis, it was so helpful that I had been to Iraq because that's where
Right.
Abraham came from. We filmed the whole story of Abraham in Iraq for a week. We were there with our crew when ISIS was there, by the way. It made it very interesting.
Yeah.
But to understand the context, and that's the beauty for not everybody's going to write books and make movies like I do and need to go 200 times. But for the average Catholic to go on a pilgrimage like this, you get a grasp of the context. That's why it's called the fifth gospel, gospel number
Mm-hmm.
5. You got Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John in black and white. And when you go there, the fifth gospel makes all the other ones pop out in Technicolor widescreen color.
Yeah.
And it helps you to understand the context. So then when you hear the readings at Mass and it talks about the rocks in the field, like the readings on Sunday or the 2 Sundays ago, without the seed went out and landed on the stones, and you're up in Galilee and you realize all those fields with that basalt, which is volcanic rock everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
It all comes back to your mind, you know.
Yeah. Well, and that's there's a kind of background question here to a couple things you've mentioned that I think is something I also wanted to bring up, and that is for those who might be, I don't know if skeptical might be as good a word as any, but those who are unsure of or just not really getting, maybe the sense here of how do we know, right, that some of these places, are
Good point.
legitimate.
That's a good discussion to have.
Yeah. And can I ask? Can I set this up quick with just a quick little sidebar from my pilgrimage? Because I remember, we had the explanation given to us, sort of the historical overview of the location we were going to go with the Holy Sepulchre, for example. And there was another group. There were several other groups on the cruise ship that we were on. So we'd go back at night. We'd see these, we'd friends from this other group, these other groups who were doing different things, and that was kind of fun. You go back and have some drinks or have dinner on the ship or whatever, and you talk with these other people. And there was a girl on the ship that was around our age that we kind of became friends with, and she was with another group that was a Protestant group, going to different sites, and she was so thrilled that they had gone to the Garden Tomb.
Oh boy!
And she was going on and on about the Garden Tomb, and I remember we didn't want to burst her bubble, but because we were all coming off this huge excitement of having been to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and just that got us thinking about what if you went all the way there, and you weren't wherever it is, right? Because she would say that we were at the wrong site. So that's the interesting question I thought I'd bring up.
By the way, the Garden Tomb was not even mentioned until 1850s. When General Gordon from England went over, and he didn't like the Holy Sepulchre for a number of reasons, and he found his own tomb and said this must have been the tomb of Christ. And I've taken groups there sometime just for the educational aspect, kind of like a tongue-in-cheek. We'd go in and hear their spiel just for the fun of discussing it afterwards.
But I think that was one that Chuck Heston is at, right? In his old documentary, he's there, I think.
It's such a sad thing. And Protestants tend to go there because they don't like the Holy Sepulchre, because they can't have their religious services in there, only if you're Catholic or Orthodox. And it doesn't look like a tomb on a hillside, the church now. But anyway, in my book on John's Gospel, I deal a lot with that Garden Tomb issue, and it's really sad. And it was not until the 1850s. It's very recent. But the question comes in: how do we know these sites are traditional? How do we know that it's real, that it just didn't get appointed by the Crusaders 1,000 years ago or something like that? Well, I'll give you an example of the mindset of the people of the East that's very different from us Westerners. They don't forget things. They remember what's important. And I say to people on the bus, how many of you know where your great-grandparents are buried? And every time I get one or two, and I said, that's because you've done a lot of genealogical research, correct? And they said, yes. But I said, nobody else on this bus knows where their great-grandparents are buried. But the Jewish people, the people of the East would never, they know. Here's an example. Jacob is on his way with his wife Rachel past Jerusalem, going past Bethlehem down to Hebron, and his wife Rachel dies in Bethlehem of childbirth, and Rachel is buried on the side of the road by the gates of Bethlehem. He buries her there, and then he goes down to Hebron. They go 400 years into Egypt. The people who's going to remember where she's buried? They're there 400 years, then 40 years in the wilderness. Then they're 365 years back in the land. And then finally they have a king. His name is Saul. He loses his donkeys. He goes to the prophet Samuel. Samuel, you're a prophet. Can you help me find my donkeys? 800 years later, Samuel said, "Go to the tomb of Rachel and you'll find your donkeys." 800 years, and they weren't even in the land for more than half of that time. And yet they still remembered where their great, 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 great grandmother was buried.
Wow.
This is the mentality of the East. They remember these
Yeah.
things. There are still stories of these Bedouins who can tell you 40 generations, the story of 40 generations back of all the exploits of those generations all the way back. And they have it
Yeah.
memorized. So they don't forget those. So I can take you to Rachel's tomb today. That's
Hmm.
4,000 years later. I can take you. How do we know it's there? Because they've never forgotten that.
Yeah.
And that's Bethlehem is another example, because when Jesus was born in that cave, babies died. 2-year-old boys and younger died because of that cave. Wise men
Hmm.
came from the east, very unusual for this town because of that cave. If you would go anytime 5 years after the birth of Jesus, 10 years, 20 years, and say to the little school kid on the street, "Hey, little boy, come here. Where was Jesus born?" He says, "Come with me, mister. I show you. I show you." They didn't forget where that was, that cave was. And then in 135 AD, Emperor Hadrian knew where it was because the Christians were going there to pray still.
Yep.
They were going there to pray at that spot in that cave. So he built a huge pagan site over top of that to the pagan gods. And that
I just
stood
love the
there.
irony of it.
Yes, that stood there for almost
Yeah.
200 years, obliterating supposedly to eliminate that Christian site. That's why he
Right.
built it there. Holy Sepulchre, too. Then
Hmm.
in 313, Queen Helen comes. Her son has now made Christianity legal, and she's a Christian. And she says to the little boy, where was Jesus born? He says, "Come, Queen, I show you underneath that temple there." So Queen Helen tears that temple down, and she finds the cave and all the graffiti that's still marking there from the first century. And she builds a basilica over that size of a football field. I've heard the first one. And then people have come there and worshiped ever since. And in 385, John Chrysostom, the great doctor of the church, said, even at this late date, folks come to visit the cave where Jesus was born. This late date, 385. Justin Martyr, and even earlier, said people visit the cave and see where the Holy Family lived in the cave. So we know those sites. Now, some we don't. Some we're certain of. The birthplace of Christ, where
Hmm.
Mary had the angel, the Annunciation. And by the way, in that cave where the angel met Mary, it said the word became flesh here on the altar.
Yes. Yeah. That was one of the spots we got to go to, which was
Yeah.
so cool.
And then, but now
Yeah.
for Emmaus, for example, there's 4 or 5 places that claim to be Emmaus, and
Right.
there's ambiguity. Now, I would never say here, this is Emmaus. I would say this
Right.
is one of 4, and this one has more credibility than the others, but there's not 100% certainty. The birth of Jesus, the death and burial of Jesus, these other
Yeah.
sites, no question.
Is that like, so I know like I've heard some people claim that supposedly the real site of Cana is in Lebanon and Cana, but I think is that the distinction of Cana in Galilee
That's why it says Cana
that's
in
made to
Galilee.
distinguish that?
There's also
Okay.
Bethlehem in Judea, because
Right.
there's another Bethlehem north in the Galilee area.
Right.
That's why it specifies, Cana of Galilee. He was
Yeah.
it was in Bethlehem of Judea.
Right. Well, even, I mean, it's, I mean, we have, Miami and Ohio. You've got
Yes.
there's California, Pennsylvania. There's all the, yeah. There's just, that's a human thing. Well, and then all the Alexandrias.
Yep. So
That guy. Yeah.
they're being very specific where that took
Right.
place.
Yeah.
And people
Yeah.
always come up with new ideas of where Cana was. There's another site now, but I don't give it any credence. But some people say, "Oh no, this is really the real Cana. That was the one over there is not really the one." The
Sure.
ones that the Franciscans are very careful. They've been there over 800 years. They were the first ones. They're called the protectorates of the
Hmm.
Holy Land, and they've been there since the 1200s. And
Yep.
they're very careful when they say this is the place. And
Right.
when you go there and it's a Franciscan church and it says "Hic" here.
Right. Well, and here's a completely off the wall. This might just be fun. A completely off the wall curveball for you, putting you on the spot, and also a segue into your Genesis book, because it's come up a few times, and I want to ask you about it a little bit here in the last couple minutes. But when you go back, of course, and I'm not asking you to give too much away, of course, so people can definitely get the book. I've got it linked below. There's so many different. Um, as I understand it, and then when I teach my students this early Genesis stuff, like those first few chapters, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but we do tend to distinguish the literary genre between those first 10, 11 chapters or so, right, of Genesis, versus when you get to this shift. And the more I read it, I think it seems pretty obvious that there's this shift when you hit the Abraham story to a more historically, sort of discernible story. So prior to that, of course, we have all sorts of different opinions on, for example, something like the site of Noah's Ark coming to rest, right? And all these different histories. But then even when you dig in, you see what says Mount Ararat. Well, it seems to say the mountains of Ararat or the region around there. So what do you say to maybe uh, your take? I'm just curious, sort of on the Noah story, or how much fruit people might even want to sort of exhaust, kind of trying to locate the ark, where they might be misunderstanding genre there. I'm just curious about that, and then maybe more about your Genesis book.
Okay, it's pretty much divided the book of Genesis into two parts.
Hmm.
Chapters 1 through 11 is what's called prehistory.
Yeah.
It just means that it's not easy to date those things, what the
Hmm.
dates are. When you come to chapter 11, where Abraham is there, now we're dealing with real dates that we can trace and go back. And it's probably around 1800 to 2000 BC. So the much of what we know by then came from oral tradition, and it was passed down. Like I said, the generation to generations, they remembered these stories and they wrote them down, and they would have known that this was divine activity going on, creation and all these things. Moses, in my book, I conclude that the first 5 books of the Bible are Mosaic. I mean, today, many of the scholars, because they have computers and they think they're smarter than the Jews and the people of the early centuries, have now said, well, Genesis wasn't written until 400 years before Christ or something, that they finally decided to come up with some ideas. There's no reason to believe it's not Mosaic and that
Hmm.
Moses wrote those books. And maybe they were edited along the way, maybe redacted a bit here and there, but they're basically Mosaic. And there's no reason to believe that God didn't reveal a lot of that, because he went up on the mountain for 40 days and he went up there more than once.
Hmm.
And God revealed things to him and he wrote, and God says, write these things down in the book.
Right.
So not only did the oral tradition, but very possibly Moses received these things as a divine revelation from God. And like 6 literal days of creation, the church has never defined whether it was 6 literal days or whether days were longer periods or whether it was a process. The
Hmm.
Catechism refers to the 6 days as being a symbolic way of explaining creation. Um, 6 days, but in the end it said, and God did all these things in the day of creation.
Mm-hmm.
In the day of creation, there's a single day. I like Augustine's view. At one place he writes, and I quote him in here, that the 7 days is a way to explain it so that a non-scientific people could understand and get an idea of how God did it. But he said, Augustine said
Hmm.
he believes God just boom created it all at once, and then he says, okay, we'll explain it this way, because if God
Okay.
gave us the scientific formula of what he did, how he created, we wouldn't understand it anyway. When a
Right.
mathematician writes all those numbers and figures on a blackboard, there's no way we would understand God's scientific formula anyway.
Yeah.
So the church has left it. We're not required to believe it was 6 literal days or a period of time, but in any case, we are required to believe that at one moment God created everything out of nothing,
Right.
apart from himself, that created life was something he created. And the interesting thing, and the soul is something also that is uniquely
Mm-hmm.
created in each person, and that's something that we have to believe in. The soul did not evolve from a monkey and all of a sudden a few more
Right.
brain cells were there and now it's a soul. No, God created the soul as a unique element in mankind that has a soul. And in the book of Genesis, the interesting is there's 2 words for create. One is bara, and that is only God does bara, and it's only new things. The other
Mm.
word, I don't remember the Hebrew word for it, but it means to shape or to fashion.
Okay.
So he creates bara, something new out of nothing. And
Right.
then the dust is there, which he created, and then he fashions man.
Sure.
He makes man. So in the English, it often seems like it's the same
It's
thing,
kind of
but
like
it's
used
very,
interchangeably,
very
but yeah.
distinct, very
Yeah.
distinct words for creation or to make. One is out of
Right.
nothing and only God does it, and the other one he does also, but we can do it as well.
And I would think of an analogy, and again, it's an analogy, and all analogies fall short at some point. But there's a huge difference between, say, the soul, the person, right, of like my daughter, for example, versus like a book I write or a lesson plan I come up with or a video
Right.
I make, where in those things, I'm just taking something that's already there and refashioning it into maybe a new
Right.
shape or something,
Right. Exactly. Well, this is my book.
versus her,
Since
like,
you
right.
said I could bring it up,
Yes.
that's the
Yes.
book. It's
Yeah.
and it reads kind of like a novel.
Yeah, I was going to ask about what the goal overall is,
The goal of it is that I want Catholics to love the Bible, realize
Yeah,
it's our book.
right.
We
Yeah.
kind of have given it over to the Protestants, the Baptists, and say, oh, they really know the Bible. We don't. But the fact is, that's our book. We had that book, and we're the ones that copied it, translated, preserved it all through the ages before Protestants
Yeah.
even existed. And that I want people to learn to love the Bible and to know that however it got to us, whether Moses did all the writing or had redactors, that doesn't, the church has the authority and has told us under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit that the book, the Bible, is inspired by God. It's infallible, authoritative, and inerrant, and it is God's word.
Yeah.
And I want people to love the Bible. And Genesis is the most important book of the Bible because it tells us where everything began, who God
Yeah.
is, where we came from, what is our purpose. Why is there pain and suffering in the world if God is a good God? Why is it? Because man sinned and he caused it to be bent now.
Yes.
He marred it all. He damaged what God had done. And God had made man with a free will, and so important that he took a risk. If man does sin, then I'm gonna have to come up with plan B. But I want people to realize that Genesis is so important because it tells us all of this. It tells us, and it even tells us now that it's screwed up, what God's going to do to rectify it.
Yeah.
And how he starts out with this great plan of redemption, recapitulation. I like to see the Bible is telling us that there's going to be Jesus himself is going to drop in behind enemy lines. And there's going
Yes.
to be this great rebellion. He's calling us all to be part of this great rebellion, and he's going to take back his land. So this is
Well,
kind
that's
of, and it's very detailed with bringing out where you can see the Trinity and where you can see the stories and all of the typology where things in the Old Testament prefigure what's coming in Jesus Christ and the new.
yeah.
But it also reads like a novel. The biggest compliment I had was the editor who did it at Ignatius Press. She's been over more than 40 years
Oh, wow.
editing books. And she said, Steve, your book was interesting because it was hard to edit because I got reading it and 10 pages into it, I'd say, oh no, I'm reading the book. I'm not editing it. She said, I got so engrossed in the way you were writing the story.
Yeah. Oh, that's exciting. Well,
So,
I have the links and everything below. Depending on when people are watching this, I think it's on pre-order right now. Is that correct? It's
no,
when's it
I've
coming
got
up?
copies.
Oh,
I've
you do?
sold a
Okay.
lot of copies already.
Oh, wow.
And if you
Okay.
buy them from my website,
Oh, yes.
catholicconvert.com, you don't get it in 24 hours,
Yeah.
but it helps our family and it's autographed copies.
Oh, there you go. Yeah.
catholicconvert.com.
Well, thank you so much, though, Steve, for coming on today. We'll definitely keep in touch. It's always a pleasure to talk to you, and I'm so delighted to talk about pilgrimages with you and get
Yeah.
people thirsting for more on Genesis, where it all started, right?
Yeah. Well, it was wonderful
Yeah.
to talk to you too. You're a good interviewer, and the
Oh,
time
thank you.
flew. It went very nice. It was a nice
Yeah.
time with you.
Well, God bless. Take care.
Thank you very much.
Yep. Always a delight to talk to Steve, and Steve has been just very, very generous over the years. I do inspired because of my experience with him on the pilgrimage we went on, and those videos I mentioned, the Footprints of God documentaries. I've shown them for many years now to my high school students, a couple of them each year. And one year, some students said, "Well, hey, could we do our own Steve Ray style documentary as a project?" And I was like, "Well, I don't know if, like, I was trying to imagine like high school students who sometimes don't have the best ideas with what they do in their video projects. I was like, okay, we'll give this a shot, and it's by far one of the highlights of every year. We do it in the spring. And lo and behold, last couple of years, some of my students have actually gotten in touch with Steve without telling me. They reached out to him and got him to make a little shout out within their video. So Steve has even helped some of them with just giving a little clip or something that they can use, or some narration. So Steve has been a good friend, and in the wake of my brother Joe's passing too, which I've shared before on this program, he passed away in 2021, had various health complications, and he was in his 6th year of seminary. And so I have him depicted there, on that picture of the three of us back in the 2009 pilgrimage. I really wanted to dedicate this to my brother. This video is coming out on his birthday. And so ask you to all, keep him in your prayers, keep all of us in your prayers. And as you are praying, pray about going on a pilgrimage yourself, because it'll really, really transform you, I think, in a really deep way. I know it did for me, and I trust it will for you too. So God bless you. Thank you so much for tuning in today to the Gracious Guest Show. I'm Mike Creavey. Really appreciate you stopping by today. And until next time, don't forget to wonder. Take care.